O tempo está correndo. Bom, boa tarde a todos. Vamos dar início às sessões da parte da tarde. Precisamos ser muito pontuais, porque nós vamos viajar hoje para Belém, dando continuidade ao segundo dia e terceiro dia do seminário, que será em Belém. E, como foi dito aqui na parte da manhã, a nossa mesa redonda ela é muito mais ampla do que está aqui. E eu não poderia continuar este evento sem expressar os meus agradecimentos à professora Mary Rubin, que é da City University de Nova York, que tornou possível a realização deste congresso, dando sentido ao Congresso Internacional, porque este é um congresso internacional, com professores não só brilhantes brasileiros que apresentaram aqui pela manhã, mas também professores americanos e um professor europeu. E ela muito ajudou na organização e no desenho do seminário, e um agradecimento muito grande a ela. Disseram que eu sou a mãe, mas o seminário tem muito mais que uma mãe, tem vários colaboradores, né? Então, é mais do que justo esse agradecimento a ela. Dito isso, eu gostaria de convidar o professor Lindolfo para presidir esta mesa, né? O professor Lindolfo dispensa maiores apresentações, é um professor da Fundação Getulio Vargas, é membro do Conselho da Fundação Getulio Vargas, já ocupou cargos altíssimos, presidente do INPA, que é um instituto de referência do Brasil, que muito nos orgulha. Quer dizer, se eu for falar do currículo do professor Lindolfo, vai ficar muito complicado. Então, eu vou parar por aqui, vou passar a palavra para ele, para ele dar as boas-vindas nessa parte da tarde e dar continuidade aos nossos trabalhos. Muito obrigada. Olha, gostaria também já de convidar o professor Sávio, que nem vai sentar, já vai sentar direto aqui, e a professora Alison, da Columbia University, para tomar o assento à mesa, e logo em seguida o professor Lindolfo vai apresentar o seu currículo.
Bom, esse grupo vai tratar da administração da sustentabilidade. Nós contamos aqui com 2 pessoas especialistas na área. Na verdade, só 2, porque o presidente não é especialista na área. A professora Alison Miller é ligada à Universidade de Columbia, nos Estados Unidos, uma grande universidade. Ela é Deputy Executive Director of the Earth Institute of Columbia, e até recentemente she wrote a book titled Sustainability Policy. So let me.
She's going to talk 30 minutes, 30 minutos no máximo, 30.
You have 30 minutes to present your. With Professor Alison will take the position.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Great. So today I'm going to follow on a lot of the comments that you heard from our colleagues earlier, and I'm going to be focusing on the organizational level sustainability management. So I'm going to talk first about the evolution of the environmental movement and how that relates to what we now call sustainability. I'm going to talk about what sustainability management is and highlight a little bit of its growth. And then I'm going to talk about a specific aspect of sustainability management, which is measurement and reporting. So first, of course, you always want to start with the definition. And as we've heard kind of multiple times earlier this morning, that sustainability lacks a single common definition. So you heard the common Brundtland Commission definition. You've heard earlier the 3 Ps or the 5 Ps of people, profit, and planet. You may have heard triple bottom line. And so these are just a couple of the many, many different ways to define sustainability. Today, though, I want to talk about another way of thinking about sustainability. And this is as the third and current phase of the environmental movement, or environmentalism. And so I want to talk you through the evolution of this movement. So first, the environmental movement began in the United States in the early 20th century, and it's epitomized by Teddy Roosevelt and land conservation. So during this time, nature was seen as beautiful and almost mystical, and it needed to be protected and separated from us. So we were. Okay, is that good? Okay. So nature was separate from us, and it needed to be protected from us. So this movement ultimately led to the creation in the United States of the national park system, and we saw similar parks and conservation areas to follow in other countries. And so in the 1960s and 1970s in the United States, we entered a new phase. And here it became an issue of public health. So during this time, you had a major oil spill off the coast of California. You had a major river catch on fire in Ohio. You had toxic waste uncovered that was buried underneath a school, and children in the local community were getting very sick. So no longer was environmental protection about preserving nature. It was about knowing that polluted environment can make you sick. So it wasn't about something that was pretty, very far away that you wanted to preserve. It was about making sure your family was safe literally in your backyard. And so this era led to the kind of foundational environmental laws in the United States, which is the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, Superfund, which provides for cleanup of toxic waste. And it led to the establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency. And then similarly, a lot of other countries modeled their own environmental laws off of these kind of seminal environmental policies. And so you see that the environmental movement, following these two different perspectives, spread globally, but really they were characterized by reactions to economic development and to public health issues specifically. So environmental quality was defined as something that might be expensive, but it was worth paying for. So you'd get higher quality of life in terms of these beautiful parks, or better health in terms of being able to breathe clean air and have clean water. But environmental protection was done after production was complete. So you had to clean up some waste, or you had to clean up something after it was consumed. So it was end of the pipe. It wasn't something you thought of in advance. And so the sustainability perspective, which is what we see now as the third phase of environmentalism, really takes an entirely different view. So sustainability changed this perspective. So the sustainability framework shows that economic prosperity is dependent on the health of ecosystems. We don't protect the biosphere because we love nature or because we want to protect our health, and those are aspects of it, but it's because we know that the environment is a foundation for long-term growth. We cannot continue to have economic growth without environmental protection. They go hand in hand. It used to be common knowledge that you could have environmental protection or you could have economic growth, but you couldn't have both. And the sustainability perspective says you cannot have one without the other. So essentially, safe water, air, food, these are absolute necessities for growth. You cannot do it without them. So the sustainability perspective uses all the tools at your advantage to ensure economic production and consumption are efficient and effective, enabling long-term sustained growth. So our goal is not the conservation of natural resources, but the continued productive use of them. So then sustainability management is essentially the practical and long-term approach to for organizational management that leads to sustainability. So it's the management practices that lead to economic production and consumption that minimize environmental impact and maximize resource conservation and reuse. So lower resource demand means lower production costs. Maximizing sustainability can mean maximizing revenue. So companies see sustainability as a competitive advantage and an opportunity to either save money or to make money. It's becoming inherent in the business model. So essentially, the depletion and degradation of our natural resources change the cost structure for all organizations. It's no longer acceptable to just not consider your waste and to not consider the impact of your water use and your energy use and your carbon footprint. Companies now routinely consider these factors when they're making management decisions. And it's actually growing into the core of management concerns. So environment typically previously used to be often housed in a philanthropy arm, or sometimes in the PR, public relations department, or even government affairs office. And what you're seeing now is that sustainability offices report to the CEO or the chief operating officer or the chief financial officer. And I think that's an indication that sustainability is taken seriously at the highest level of executives, that it's not something that is an afterthought, that it's really built into the business model. So another way to think about sustainability management is the latest step in the past century's evolution of organizational management. So over the past century, managers added tools to their toolkit as the global economy grew and the nature of business changed. So now a typical manager knows financial management, they know human resource management, they know information management, communications, production processes, strategy. They know all of these things because that's what being a manager means. And so what we're saying now is that sustainability is just one more piece of that package. So it's added to this general toolkit, and you have to know about the physical dimensions of sustainability, about water, waste, location of your building, energy efficiency, carbon footprint. All of these aspects of sustainability just become part of what you do. So, we believe that in a decade, all managers will be sustainability managers. You won't have to point it out. It's not something that is separate. It just becomes core to what your organization does and how they do business. So that is the good news. The bad news is that there are challenges to doing this. You need incentives to change behavior, and you need resources to pay for incentives. So you really need buy-in from senior leaders to be able to implement these changes. You need new thinking about resource use and waste. You need to understand integrated thinking, integrated systems, and how these various aspects work together. And you really need to value the long term. Companies who are only concerned about the next quarterly report will find that it's very difficult to implement sustainability strategies and will not get the full benefit of them if they're not looking at beyond those immediate concerns. This is really a long-term strategy. And so, and also standard operating procedures are slow to change. People can be resistant to making changes within organizations, particularly ones that can have quite a lot of upheaval in some cases. So implementing these changes really require this new managerial skill set who know about the various aspects of sustainability. They may not be engineers, although they need to be able to speak to engineers and to speak to architects and to understand the basics of hydrology without necessarily being scientists themselves, but they need to be able to manage all of these different inputs. So I put together just a really short list of some of the organizational practices that can help incorporate sustainability into organizations. So first is integrating sustainability into strategic planning and corporate culture. Sustainability needs to be built into the core business model. Translate sustainability into specific and clear goals. You need to have targets, and those need to be articulated to the company and to external stakeholders. We need key indicators and targets to manage both company, department, and individual performance. They could potentially be included in performance evaluations, for example. You should identify and address issues that have a tangible, positive impact. So particularly when you're beginning to implement sustainability strategies, having some kind of low-hanging fruit and quick wins can be very important in building momentum within a company. Recognizing employees with encouragement, showcasing, highlighting what employees are doing, or winners in some sort of sustainability challenge can be very encouraging. And also including sustainability and skill building tools and professional development for staff, particularly for those who might not be that interested in sustainability or not be familiar with sustainability. If you're going to really incorporate it into your culture, it's important that the employees know why it is that they're doing it and what it is. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the growth in sustainability management. We've seen growth in green jobs, green markets, green products, corporate sustainability reporting, corporate sustainability ranking, technologies products. You see a couple of images here. So I'm going to talk about a 2013 report that was done by MIT Sloan and Boston Consulting Group, surveyed corporate executives and found that almost 50% of companies surveyed had changed their business models to incorporate sustainability opportunities. And of those that did change their business model, just over 60% of those had found added profit through those sustainability strategies. I don't know if you can see the numbers here, but it was interesting that the report also found that developing countries more often change their business models to incorporate sustainability than developed countries. African companies were actually the highest at just under 70%, and North America is about 40%. And kind of South America looks about 50% here. Another report, this one in 2014, done by McKinsey, surveyed corporate executives and found that top executives see sustainability management as increasingly becoming more strategic and integral part of their businesses. In past surveys, they found that the most often reasons for choosing sustainability was for cost cutting or reputation management. But in 2014, 43% of companies, which is the highest percentage, do so to align sustainability with their overall business goals, mission, and values. And I think this is really important because CEOs and senior executives don't just see it as an add-on to their business. They're really integrating it into their core. It also showed that CEOs are twice as likely as they were in 2012 to say that sustainability is their top priority. It's still small, it's only 13%, but 36% say that sustainability is at least one of their top 3 priorities. So again, this trend is very encouraging. So next, I want to talk about sustainability measurement. And Steve Cohen touched on this a little bit earlier, quoted Drucker, what doesn't get measured doesn't get done. Measurement is a core management tool that facilitates decision-making when there are trade-offs. It enables you to understand how you're progressing, and it's essential if you're going to be incorporating sustainability into your operations. At a more macro level, it's important to measure the private sector sustainability activities for a number of reasons, one of which is that measuring sustainability can help companies and governments gear policies accordingly. It also can allow for industry standards to emerge and for companies to compare themselves with their peers. And perhaps most importantly, it allows consumers and investors to really make better, more informed decisions. Fortunately, measurement of sustainability is increasing significantly, and this is most commonly manifested in external-facing reports, corporate sustainability reports. You see 2 here, but essentially sustainability reports have become mainstream. Most major corporations issue a sustainability report. Thousands are published annually. And many of these companies also report environmental data to third-party organizations like CDP and Dow Jones Sustainability Indices and many others. So there are other third-party organizations like the Global Reporting Initiative, which is trying to build a framework, a common framework and guidelines for what these reports should include and how companies can use their data to build sustainability reports. They're basically working to try to standardize some of these measurement and reporting techniques and tools. But the problem is that the existing measurements and metrics are not perfect. And this stems from the fact that there is no common definition of sustainability. So if you can't define sustainability, it's very difficult to measure it. So currently there are hundreds of different metrics for sustainability. There's probably 24 different ways to measure your carbon emissions. So that makes it very difficult when you're trying to compare different organizations. How do you compare the data when they're reported very differently? When you're looking at 2 different sustainability reports, it can sometimes be comparing apples to oranges. Companies can report and cannot report what they want to. These are not required in most cases. And sometimes they can be more communications tools and PR reports rather than, sophisticated, serious documents. So it really is the onus is on the reader to understand the methodology that went into the report to really be able to understand what the information is included there. There's also companies on the company side. Most sustainability offices are not particularly large, and they get requests from as many as 150 different external organizations asking for data so that they can be included in some organizations' list of the top 5 green companies. And so they want to provide this data, but it's often for each one of these different organizations, they're asking for something somewhat different, or they're asking for it in a different format or over a different time period, which for the analysts working at the company, it takes up quite a bit of time, and it almost becomes more an issue of disclosing information and transparency and just getting the information out rather than being a tool to measure your own progress, which is really what measurement is for. And so what the key problem that I've kind of defined here is that there's no standard metrics or framework that's universally accepted, backed by compelling theory, and that's influential in policy and decision making. So I believe that we need a standardized, generally accepted indicators that would measure sustainability for everyone in the public sector, in the private sector, that any organization can use, that can be a snapshot for you to understand what the sustainability of a company is. So whether it's 10 metrics or whether it's 20 metrics, every organization would measure those same metrics in the same way. And so you could more easily compare sustainability across companies. It certainly wouldn't replace full comprehensive sustainability reports. They're not mutually exclusive, but it would help to eliminate some of the redundancy that you get from all of these different metrics. Ultimately, we think that it could replicate the applicability and universality of traditional financial indicators. Everyone knows what return on investment and profit and loss means. So what we need to do is develop the sustainability equivalent of those types of measures. And to do so, we believe that there is a role for the public sector. As I mentioned, there are a couple of organizations, third-party organizations, that are working towards standardizing what type of information goes out there. GRI is one of them, and there are a number of other international organizations doing the same. But in national governments, they could help to serve as a moderator of these different stakeholders to generate consensus towards some sort of short list of standardized metrics. And then ultimately, I believe that they would develop the tools and the regulations to actually enforce mandatory reporting of these measures, because currently in most countries, it's not required to report on these types of sustainability indicators. So mandatory sustainability reporting is something that is gaining some momentum globally. France, Denmark, and South Africa are a couple of countries that are really just beginning to experiment with mandatory sustainability measurement and reporting. A 2013 report looked at this growth, and they saw that in 2006, 58% of policies on sustainability reporting were mandatory. And by 2013, 72% of a total of 180 policies across 45 countries were actually mandatory. And so I'm just going to go through very briefly a couple of those examples. So France has required publicly listed companies to report on social and environmental impact in annual reports. In 2010, it actually expanded, so it's quite comprehensive. So it now requires subsidiaries of foreign companies that are listed in France and unlisted companies with subsidiaries located in France to also report on this information. And they do require verification, third-party verification of the information in these reports. This is being phased in by company size, so it's not fully implemented yet, but it's particularly strong. South Africa has gone another way, and they are requiring integrated reports, which requires sustainability information to be included in traditional financial reporting. So they're already putting out these financial reports. They now are required to include sustainability information. And that's mandatory for all companies listed on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. And the third example is China. So it required all state-owned enterprises to publish sustainability reports by 2012. And you saw that in 2011, it increased over 700% from 2008 in the number of corporations that did release sustainability reports. However, while they require them to release reports, they don't specify what goes in them. So in 2011, companies used an average of less than 2 metrics in the report, and over 50% of the reports didn't include any metrics. So you can see here that there's a gap between policy intent and implementation. And this is not unique to China. And so it is important that if you are going to be mandating reporting, that you specify either categories or the specific metrics themselves, which again comes back to the need for a common understanding or some sort of universal sustainability indicators. So just in conclusion, I believe that we have the potential to create a sustainable economic era. The global economy can be managed to minimize impacts on the environment while enabling continued growth. There is no trade-off between economic development and environmental protection. And companies are increasingly recognizing that the physical dimensions of sustainability must be integrated into their core management operations. And they're actively and increasingly seeking ways to do this. So whether the drivers are internal or external to an organization, the drivers for these shifts exist and are greatly expanding. Sustainability is not a passing fad. It is a significant and growing part of the global economy. So as sustainability becomes clearer, better defined, and more accessible to a greater number of users, and more integral to core business models, its uptake will expand, leading us on a path towards a global sustainable economy. That's it.
Thank you.
Dando prosseguimento após essa excelente, às vezes excellent exposition.
Thank you.
Yeah. Tem a palavra o Dr. Sávio Bittencourt, que atualmente pertence aqui à fundação da EBAP, é o professor da EBAP, e também do Ministério Público, formado em Direito, mas ele me contou aqui que também fez pós-graduação em História e Geografia Humana, de modo que tem todo o arcabouço apropriado para tratar de sustentabilidade.
Obrigado. Boa tarde a todos. Eu queria cumprimentar o conselheiro Lindolfo de Carvalho Dias, a professora Fátima Baima, a minha companheira de mesa, diretora Alisson, após sua grande palestra. E eu vou tentar falar devagar para não enlouquecer os tradutores. Numa palestra passada minha, teve um tradutor que se suicidou. Mas dizem que ele já tinha problema com a esposa, tal, que não foi culpa minha. Então, eu vou tentar, porque alguns termos jurídicos que nós vamos utilizar, que a tradução é difícil, porque o significado não existe exatamente como ele é aqui no Brasil, na língua inglesa, porque não há a função daquela mesma forma. Então, eu vou tentar fazer. Mas é muito importante para os brasileiros também. Eu sou professor aqui da casa e dou aula de políticas públicas e de sustentabilidade. E sou promotor de... Agora, na verdade, sou procurador de justiça, que é a segunda instância dos promotores, do que a gente conhece como promotor de justiça, membro do Ministério Público Brasileiro. E, então, portanto, o meu conhecimento da área ambiental foi forjado nessa atividade, que é uma atividade judicial, uma atividade próxima do judiciário, de ter as investigações e os processos que são necessários para a responsabilização pelo dano ambiental. Então, digamos que esse conhecimento que comecei a ter, empírico da questão ambiental, veio em função dessa atividade jurídica de ter a função de tratar da responsabilidade ambiental de empresas, seja a responsabilidade criminal, seja a responsabilidade civil, seja a responsabilidade administrativa. E tratar da responsabilidade ambiental dos governos, do Estado em si, do poder público, porque o Ministério Público, e é difícil traduzir exatamente isso, Ministério Público, é uma tradução difícil, porque a tradução que se faz, geralmente, é que os promotores são prosecutors. Isso dá a noção de que ele trabalha apenas com os casos criminais, com os processos criminais. Mas, no Brasil, o Ministério Público tem uma formação muito mais ampla, trabalha com todos os tipos de responsabilidades e com muitos assuntos. Então, portanto, o Ministério Público, apesar de ser parte da administração pública, está alocado dentro da administração pública, ele age com muita independência em relação a essa administração pública. Ele tem a capacidade de fiscalizar a política pública que é proposta pelo governo, executada ou não é executada, né? Como mais das vezes acontece. Então, através dessa análise de ser, digamos, um fiscal do próprio poder público no exercício da política pública de controle ambiental e de proteção ambiental e das atividades privadas, que eu aqui me coloco para fazer essa apresentação. Então, a primeira parte dessa minha fala é no sentido de colocar o discurso no seu correto entendimento, do ponto de vista da efetividade que nós estamos tratando. Eu acho que, em relação aos conceitos de sustentabilidade e a boa intenção de todos a respeito da preservação ambiental, estamos quase todos de acordo. O que nós ouvimos até aqui foram falas muito ricas e que se complementam no sentido de dar noção dessa emergência, dessa necessidade de se tratar de se preservar o meio ambiente e da possibilidade que isso seja feito junto com o desenvolvimento. Ou seja, afastando aquela hipótese inicial apenas de um antagonismo entre uma coisa e outra, entre desenvolvimento e sustentabilidade, entre desenvolvimento e defesa do meio ambiente. Por outro lado, o que nós vemos na prática, num país como o nosso, e aí eu vou falar da minha realidade, mas é uma realidade que espelha muito os outros países da América Latina e da América do Sul, nós temos uma legislação extremamente detalhista e apta a fazer uma boa proteção do meio ambiente, mas não temos necessariamente uma prática enraizada na defesa desse meio ambiente, o que faz com que essa atividade seja muito mais punitiva do que deveria ser. Em outras palavras, em termos de sustentabilidade, nós avançamos monstruosamente no discurso, avançamos grandemente na legislação e avançamos pifiamente na questão da efetividade e das práticas a serem enraizadas nas atividades que tratam do meio ambiente. Nós estamos falando de empresas de ponta que incluíram nas suas práticas efetivamente essa preocupação. Nós estamos falando daquelas que incluem como top 3, né, como das 3 grandes prioridades, adequam social e politicamente o seu discurso, mas continuam tratando do meio ambiente como se ele fosse um problema. Então, se esse é um problema nas empresas, esse também é um problema dos governos, que muitas das vezes têm suas políticas públicas definidas não de acordo com as prioridades nacionais, que é o que discutimos na Fundação Getulio Vargas, e é o motivo pela qual essa fundação existe, mas são discutidas em torno de um calendário político eleitoral que premia apenas o curto prazo e que desvincula a questão ambiental das práticas políticas mais duradouras, porque o que se faz a longo prazo não repercute na eleição seguinte. Então, portanto, essa prática política abominável e que nós conhecemos muito bem, faz parte da nossa democracia em exercício e ainda infanto-juvenil, mas que é algo que realmente nos preocupa porque os governos têm muito menos compromisso do que seria necessário. E não precisamos ir longe. Vamos falar apenas de preocupações que são governamentais diretamente e que não são da conta da responsabilidade das empresas, como a poluição por elas criadas, mas a poluição que o governo em si tem obrigação de tratar. Vamos falar de resíduos sólidos. Vamos falar da poluição provocada pela falta de saneamento básico, que são duas emergências absolutamente importantes e que estão sendo hoje tratadas a passos de tartaruga por todos os governos. E aí não há a predileção política por este ou por aquele, mas são assuntos que há muito tempo no anedotário político nacional não dão muito voto, tratar de lixo e de esgoto. Então, portanto, da parte do poder público, nós percebemos, digamos, uma certa inapetência para tratar desses assuntos, que são assuntos fundamentais. Os acordos setoriais que tratam dos resíduos sólidos, principalmente o setor de embalagem, passa por uma discussão apoteótica de fechamento, porque a nossa lei manda que seja feito um grande acordo com todos os produtores, todos os integrantes daquela cadeia, para que seja lá, digamos, disciplinada uma responsabilidade compartilhada pela solução das embalagens. É um acordo que está sendo construído sob uma forte pressão de determinados ramos empresariais, que na Europa investem uma vultosa quantidade de dinheiro para a solução concreta, efetiva desse problema, e no Brasil preferem que as soluções sejam compartilhadas de tal forma que eles venham fazer pequenos benefícios em determinadas cooperativas de catadores, levando a questão social a um determinado patamar de marketing, sem que isso signifique uma transformação concreta do meio ambiente. Então, o primeiro ponto a se falar é que tudo isso que nós estamos discutindo aqui está no campo do ideal. Para os que estudaram direito, o Hans Kelsen, filósofo austríaco do direito, falava no mundo do dever ser. É como deve ser, mas não é como é. Existe um outro mundo, um mundo concreto, que ainda padece dessa cultura. A cultura de que a política pública obedece uma discricionariedade quase que absoluta, que podemos realizar Copa do Mundo, Olimpíadas e gastar vultosas quantias nessas atividades, e podemos fazer isso em detrimento do saneamento básico no Brasil. Se essa é uma má notícia, eu acho que todas essas questões que trago, que são responsabilidades do poder público, da administração pública, que eu frequento como administrador público e como fiscal das políticas públicas, trazem também boas notícias. Essas boas notícias são que esses mercados, o mercado do saneamento, o mercado de resíduos sólidos, bem tratados, bem disciplinados e bem regulados, que é uma tarefa do poder público, são extremamente generosos à criatividade, ao empreendimento, à geração de emprego, à geração de recursos. Se nós tratarmos metade do esgoto que não é tratado no Brasil, nós injetamos nessa economia, através da participação da iniciativa privada, obviamente, não é o governo que tem que fazer isso com estatais paquidérmicas, mas regulando efetivamente de forma competente esses serviços, nós traremos para a economia, não só em construção civil, em investimento imediato, mas como operação desses serviços, cuidando do meio ambiente, ao mesmo tempo gerando empregos, recursos, tributos, tudo isso que a gente diz, ou que se diz, que o meio ambiente atrapalha. Não, o meio ambiente, hoje, na nossa escala, é um grande fomentador de economia, mas de uma política pública coerente que tenha realmente responsabilidade com resolver as coisas, não em maquiá-las. No setor privado, eu acho que algumas mudanças são bem sinalizadas com incremento de responsabilidade. Digamos que as empresas no Brasil têm demonstrado 3 graus de aceitação da sustentabilidade em sua atividade. O primeiro grau, o primeiro degrau, seria o do controle da poluição, o que vale dizer o salário mínimo. Isso não é favor que ela faz, nem fruto da sua responsabilidade com a sociedade. É fruto da sua responsabilidade legal mesmo. Se ela não fizer, ela é punida. Então, portanto, e a responsabilidade civil pelo dano ambiental no Brasil, quero dizer aos meus amigos estrangeiros, ela é objetiva, ela independe de culpa. Nós não estamos tratando de uma análise que o sujeito precisa ser culpado para ser punido. Se ele produz a poluição, independentemente de ter culpa ou não, de ter vontade ou não, ele é obrigado a ressarcir o meio ambiente que é lesado, direta e indiretamente. Então, portanto, controlar a poluição não é mais do que obrigação de quem faz, é obrigação de cidadania de qualquer cidadão e de qualquer empresa. Pois bem, o segundo patamar é quando se percebe que, além de controlar a poluição, é interessante também se fazer preventivamente esse controle, em vez de nos preocuparmos apenas com o floor level, apenas com o chão da empresa, com a deposição final de resíduos e de emissões, se preocupar com certas coisas, com a compra que se faz a mais, com a energia que se gasta mais, com a água que se gasta mais, com o reuso e com coisas dessa natureza. De montar esquemas que eles chamam de simbiose empresarial, em que um compra o resíduo do outro e assim vai. Esses outros modelos que já estão famosos, que as pessoas já estão utilizando. Digamos que nessa fase há uma preocupação preventiva. Mas esse não é o nosso foco. Nós damos aula aqui para a graduação da administração, porque aqui temos orgulho de formar o futuro dos grandes administradores do país, pensando justamente em incutir nesses jovens que estão aqui, ainda enquanto são esponjas absorvendo nossas preocupações de nós mais velhos e impertinentes, que absorvam esse compromisso ético. Estar ao lado da sustentabilidade significa ter um lado. E esse lado não é contra o desenvolvimento, nem é contra quem quer que seja, nem é contra a inclusão do povo, da preocupação social como um dos elementos, um dos pilares da sustentabilidade, mas é dizer não ao crescimento a qualquer preço e dizer não à demagogia que se utiliza da pobreza para deixar de tomar as medidas que são necessárias. Então, portanto, há um ditado no Brasil, que também eu acho que é intraduzível, que é de pequenininho que se torce o pepino. Isso é problema de vocês traduzirem. Tá? Então, quer dizer, desde pequeno que nós temos que cuidar dessa compreensão. Há um lado ético, que é fazer a coisa certa. Quando a Alisson coloca que é necessário fazer uma uniformidade, é muito bom que a lei tenha esse papel de uniformidade para que nós saibamos de antemão o que é certo fazer. E no Brasil nós temos uma legislação extremamente detalhista. É alucinantemente detalhista para alguns operadores. Mas, enfim, nós temos lá um modelo de padronização para as atividades que podem ser discutidos pelos empresários. Mas é o lado certo, o lado em que o meio ambiente passa a ser estratégico. Não é mais o controle da poluição, não é mais uma visão de economia preventiva, mas é como eu posso viver economicamente e com lucro, porque não é pecado, dentro de uma economia verde. Dentro do ponto de vista de eu poder criar pessoas aqui dentro que vão, por sua vez, criar modelos de gestão e criar novos empreendimentos que limpem o meio ambiente, que o mantenham limpo. Não só vão fazer as velhas atividades mais sustentáveis, mas como vão transformá-las em algo que seja mais positivo para a humanidade e para essa comunidade, para essa sociedade, a partir desse papel. Por último, eu não quero estourar o tempo, eu queria falar do papel da universidade. E aí, eu acho que nós temos um papel extremamente importante. Então, a universidade, entendo também como papel educacional da educação ambiental como um todo. Não só da universidade, mas que vai desde o ensino fundamental, do ensino médio, à universidade. Nós temos a obrigação ética de tratarmos transversalmente da questão ambiental. Ou seja, meio ambiente não é uma disciplina isolada que se coloca num curso para dizer, bom, nós somos aqui politicamente corretos, então, portanto, nós temos um maluco biodegradável, como diz o outro, para dar aula de direito ambiental na faculdade de Direito, gestão ambiental na faculdade de Administração, natureza e sociedade na faculdade de Ciências Sociais e de História, e por aí vai, disciplinas verdes para pessoas esquisitas. A ideia é que essa filosofia seja transversal, e não só as disciplinas especiais, que são muito importantes, mas que toda disciplina tenha incluída em seu conteúdo programático, em sua metodologia de ensino, em sua avaliação, as questões de sustentabilidade. Então, portanto, não é uma atitude isolada, eu acho que é um bom começo que as faculdades de administração, de direito, de engenharia tenham essas especialidades, mas é necessário que essas especialidades estejam entranhadas em todas as áreas do saber que são ministradas naquele curso. Não há uma sustentabilidade de um curso em termos acadêmicos teóricos quando há apenas disciplinas isoladas. E, bom, deixa aqui os verdes falarem. Foi como também a professora Alisson tocou, de que o meio ambiente está distante de nós. É uma outra coisa e nós, humanos, analisamos de fora esse grande globo chamado meio ambiente. Nós também, na universidade, não podemos falar do meio ambiente como se fosse um assunto isolado, mas um assunto que perpassa todos os setores da universidade, nas suas práticas de pesquisa, de extensão, de pós-graduação e de graduação. E aqui na universidade nós temos, então, vários esforços estão sendo feitos nesse sentido, e nós, por força da clarividência do nosso pró-reitor Antônio Freitas, professor Antônio Freitas, tivemos o ingresso da EBAP. A EBAP é a escola de administração mais antiga do Brasil, e nós tivemos a entrada da EBAP, da Fundação Getulio Vargas, no Global Compact da ONU, que se traduz nos princípios de sustentabilidade, chamados PRIME, que aqui são chefiados pelo nosso amigo do ISAI, também da Fundação Getúlio Vargas, o capítulo brasileiro, professor Norma de Paula Arruda, que aqui está presente, nos honrando por sua presença, e que tem aglutinado os esforços, não só da Fundação Getúlio Vargas, mas de toda e qualquer instituição de ensino disposta a abraçar esses princípios, que inclui o enraizamento da sustentabilidade em todas as suas atividades acadêmicas. Então, portanto, a resposta ética que a universidade precisa dar, ela é muito clara. Nós temos um lado de fazer a coisa certa e fazer essa coisa chamada sustentabilidade ter efetividade. Porque senão, nós vamos retornar aqui ano que vem, todos os anos, para falar de pequenos avanços pontuais, sempre muito lentamente construídos, quando nós estamos precisando reverter o consumo da biodiversidade mundial a uma velocidade supersônica. Então, portanto, eu acho que o compromisso que o setor de ensino tem, que a universidade tem, e que, por sua vez, a EBAP está tentando desempenhar através de várias iniciativas, inclusive o Laboratório de Sustentabilidade, que eu tenho o prazer e a honra de presidir, de coordenar, tentar fazer com que esse assunto seja efetivamente prioritário, e prioritário nas práticas educacionais, não é prioritário apenas no discurso. O discurso é muito importante, ele convence, mas o exemplo arrasta. Muito obrigado.
Tem perguntas, pode abrir para perguntas.
Nós estamos com o tempo um pouco limitado, mas ainda tem algum para atender questões. Se alguém tem alguma questão. Doutor Haroldo Lemos.
Bom, obrigado, Lindolfo. Primeiro, queria parabenizar os dois palestrantes. O Sávio eu já conheço há bastante tempo, ele sabe disso. Eu já tinha falado muito mal de você para o Lindolfo, mas... então, queria parabenizar. Eu queria só fazer uma pequena observação com relação à apresentação da Alisson. Você colocou uma série de questões do environmental management, da gestão ambiental, e uma delas, a necessidade de incentivos, né? Em 2011, o Programa das Nações Unidas para o Meio Ambiente fez um relatório que para a Rio +20, a Rio 2012, que era o Green Economy, economia verde. E ele mostrava que nós temos, no mundo, muitos subsídios que são totalmente insustentáveis. E, então, ele queria, a proposta era que esses subsídios fossem reduzidos e eles fossem aplicados, incentivos e subsídios para as questões de sustentabilidade. O exemplo mais marcante disso é pesca. né? Os países que têm grandes frotas pesqueiras do mundo, Canadá, Espanha, Japão, etc., estão dando 27 bilhões de dólares por ano de subsídio às suas frotas pesqueiras. Como é que o subsídio é dado? O combustível para eles sai quase de graça, para que eles possam ir até o fim do mundo buscar peixe e trazer de volta. Com isso, a capacidade de pesca é o dobro da capacidade de reprodução dos peixes hoje. E os peixes oceânicos, os peixes nobres, estão acabando. Então, quer dizer, quando se discutiu isso na Rio+20, na Rio 2012, ninguém quis discutir essa questão. Essa é uma questão que precisa ser enfrentada. Esses subsídios insustentáveis precisam ser reduzidos e transformados em incentivos e subsídios para as questões da gerência da sustentabilidade. Então, era essa questão que eu queria levantar. Parabéns pela sua apresentação também. Obrigado.
Bom, não, ali.
Hello, hi. My name is Luis Rodriguez, and this question for Alison. Alison, I was very interested in your. By the way, it's a great presentation, but in terms of your sustainability reporting systems, which one would you say is the most widely used or accepted reporting system in the world right now, or in the U.S.?
Well, I'd say GRI, Global Reporting Initiative, is certainly the most commonly used framework for guidelines for sustainability reporting themselves. In terms of third-party organizations that are also collecting data, the Dow Jones Sustainability Indice is one of the top organizations from the company's perspective. They are very selective in terms of the organizations that get included in the indices. And so in speaking with corporations, that is the top priority for them. So when they're filling out these many surveys and data requests, Dow Jones, the Sustainability Index, is something that they do prioritize.
Thank you.
Well, I also have a question.
Boa tarde. Boa tarde. Tá ligado? Eu sou Michele Sampaio, sou professora da Universidade Federal do Estado do Rio de Janeiro. É uma pergunta para a Alison e comentário para o Sávio. Alison, minha pergunta para você é assim, eu entendo a importância, obviamente, de ter padrões para os reportes, mas especialmente no caso do Brasil, quando a gente fala em pequenas e médias empresas, por exemplo, se você vai procurar na GRI, pouquíssimas empresas reportam lá pela dificuldade de seguir esses padrões. Quando você fala em colocar esses padrões, é algo que está sendo pensado nesses diferentes níveis de empresa, especialmente quando a gente está pensando mundialmente, né? Então, pequenas empresas têm uma estrutura muito diferente de uma grande empresa que pode ter um setor inteiro para fazer um relatório de sustentabilidade, por exemplo, né? Então, essa é a minha pergunta para você. E o comentário para o Sávio, eu, como professora de universidade, concordo plenamente com o que você coloca, que a sustentabilidade tem que entrar, né, na base de cada uma das nossas disciplinas, mas eu vejo a dificuldade que é, dentro da universidade, fazer esse trabalho. Como você entra numa disciplina de um professor e fala para ele, vamos rever o que você está ensinando e tentar colocar nesse dia a dia a sustentabilidade. É algo que eu gostaria de ouvir um pensamento seu a respeito, ou até da prática, do que seria isso. Obrigada.
So if I think I understand your question, the ability to report from smaller companies to larger companies, and I think some of the advantage of GRI is that they don't specify which metrics to report, because maybe companies don't have access to that type of data. So they have a framework that you can, choose among the different categories. And so they do lay it out pretty clearly how an organization could use the guidelines for their own uses. But I think that also goes back to the need for some common understanding of what sustainability means. From our perspective, from Columbia University, there are many faculty working on research in this area. What are the 10 or so indicators that could tell you as much about a sustainability of a company as 50? And so they're looking at that in ways that would be, efficient and effective in capturing sustainability. But I think there's more work to be done there, for sure.
Com base nas palestras. Depois de tudo, né?
Para terminar, nós estamos com um tempo muito restrito. Para terminar, professora Fátima, eu gostaria de fazer um comentário.
Fazer um comentário e, ao mesmo tempo, solicitar as observações e também comentários da mesa, né? Eu percebi na palestra de ambos uma grande preocupação com a questão da integração, né? Parece que a integração é algo extremamente importante e que está faltando nos programas. Quando eu vejo a fala do professor Sávio, que diz que há necessidade da inclusão de programas que trabalham a questão do meio ambiente, da sustentabilidade, transversalmente, mas a questão precisa ser colocada como que se vai colocar em prática essa transversalidade, porque essa transversalidade requer uma integração. Quando nós percebemos a fala do Exército na parte da manhã, mostrando um dos desafios que são as sobreposições que ocorrem e que dificultam você tomar uma decisão. Nós estamos numa escola, numa instituição que muito tem trabalhado a gestão, e este é um tema de gestão, né? Como é que nós podemos, em termos de competências gerenciais, trabalhar este desafio da integração, né? Dessa integração na transversalidade, dessa integração que permita que pessoas com formação diferenciadas, porque as próprias definições de sustentabilidade são amplas, há uma pleiade, isso requer que o engenheiro defina a sustentabilidade ou se preocupe numa perspectiva mais energética, que uma pessoa com uma formação filosófica trabalhe mais a questão da legalidade e da ética, né? Toda uma questão social, a responsabilidade social, a sustentabilidade social. Então, são tamanhas as variáveis que há necessidade de uma integração. Então, eu queria ouvir da professora Alisson e também do professor Sávio como que eles sugerem essas abordagens para que os cursos se tornem mais efetivos, né? Porque quando o professor Sávio mencionou que há muita legislação, mas há uma carência de prática. Onde falhamos? Há muito enfoque acadêmico, há necessidade... Como é que se dá? Como é que a gente pode começar um debate profícuo para introduzir reformas e atuações mais concretas nos nossos programas educacionais? Foi claro?
So your question is, what can we do to integrate sustainability into education programs? Yes. Well, I don't think that that's going to be a quick process necessarily. I know what we're doing at the Earth Institute at Columbia, for one example, is, we created an entirely new organizational structure within the university that is truly cross-disciplinary. So all of our education programs that our Earth Institute integrate all of the academic disciplines relevant to sustainability management. We are part of the Central University, and we're not part of any specific school, so that schools don't see us as a competitor. We partner with the law school to integrate sustainability into their existing programs. We don't recreate an environmental law program. We allow our faculty to teach in the law programs that already exist. And we provide the scientific expertise that the law professors can draw upon, for example. So I think that it's both a top-down administrative leadership requirement from the senior leaders at universities to recognize that the schools need to work together, and then also from the faculty and from the students also who are very passionate about sustainability to request these types of programs and these types of courses because they naturally see the connections between these sustainability issues.
Bom, Michele, você conhece o professor Norma? Vou te apresentar o professor Norma, porque eu acho que esse esforço do Prime é justamente esforço que a Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro engrandeceria muito lá o capítulo brasileiro, do Estado do Rio de Janeiro, a UERJ, engrandeceria muito. A Unirio, desculpa, Unirio, que é muita universidade para um estado só, né? É a Universidade do Estado do Rio de Janeiro, Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro e Universidade Federal do Estado do Rio de Janeiro. Então, e a Universidade Rural, né? Tem a Rural, tem a da zona do norte do estado, temos outras. Muita universidade. Muito bem, graças a Deus. Mas seria ótimo que a Unirio se somasse a esse esforço, porque nós estamos discutindo como fazemos. Se nós formos olhar, e aí já olho para a integração, se nós formos olhar hoje, nós que trabalhamos com meio ambiente de forma geral, como nós aprendemos? Errando. Porque nós não tivemos nenhuma formação em nenhum lugar, nem no ensino fundamental, nem no ensino médio, nem no ensino superior. Eu, para não dizer a verdade, na 4ª série, li um livro, lá num colégio chamado Instituto Gay-Lussac, em Niterói, que na época era chamado de mini-gay, porque não havia outras implicações para a utilização da palavra gay naquela época, que ele só designava o Gay-Lussac, a pessoa do físico-químico francês. Né? Mas depois mudou para Instituto Gay-Lussac primeiro grau, para que as crianças não tivessem tomado uma decisão tão apressadamente, correto? Então, a ideia que foi aquele contato, foi um contato bastante marcante, com um livro chamado Pássaro à Barragem, um livro francês, que contava a história ambientalmente importante. Mas são contatos, assim, de professores iluminados que tinham lá aquele interesse e aqui e ali pincelam um pouco do seu talento sobre os alunos. Mas não é algo institucionalizado. Então, portanto, agora o primeiro passo é colocar essas disciplinas como se fossem brincos da universidade, que não são parte do corpo, apenas adornam essa universidade, que são as nossas disciplinas. O segundo passo é o passo que o capítulo brasileiro está conseguindo fazer com o partilhar de experiências. E esse assunto é de tão interesse público que nós não temos o direito de produzir um conhecimento e um método de agir em defesa da sustentabilidade dentro da universidade que não seja público e compartilhado. Egoisticamente, percebe? Então, portanto, eu acho que a generosidade desse capítulo brasileiro, de todo o Global Compact, mas do capítulo brasileiro do Prime, ele tem essa lógica que aqui, pedindo licença ao Norma, te convido a participar. Em relação, já para terminar, às políticas de integração, tanto no poder público quanto no poder privado, nós temos uma dificuldade muito grande no Brasil, no poder público, e eu reconheço que não é fácil ser gestor público hoje. Assim, membro do Ministério Público, como se diz aí, teve um ministro importante do Supremo Tribunal Federal, é engenheiro de obra pronta. O sujeito, para ver, ele chega lá e fala assim, errou ali, errou aqui, mas não foi ele que fez o prédio. É difícil ser gestor hoje. Eu acho que a pessoa se candidatar a prefeito numa cidade pequena tem que fazer um teste de sanidade mental no sujeito. Porque o município recebeu da nossa Constituição, o professor Condo, meu coordenador, tanta responsabilidade, tem que cuidar do meio ambiente, tem que ter plano municipal de resíduo sólido, de saneamento, cuidar de criança, de idoso, de abrigo de criança, de recuperação de drogado, de egresso do sistema penitenciário. Meu Deus do céu. É muita política pública se fazer por uma verba que, consideremos, fora dos grandes municípios brasileiros, que não chegam a 100. Nós temos milhares de municípios no Brasil, mas nós temos 100 grandes municípios. Os municípios não são superavitários. Então, portanto, eu reconheço que não é fácil fazer essa integração. É necessário rediscutir o Pacto Federativo, que hoje nós criamos para os estados uma responsabilidade ambiental muito leve. Ele tem lá ele tem lá o órgão ambiental estadual, já começou a passar para o município todo o licenciamento ambiental das coisas mais básicas, das coisas razoavelmente médias, né, para os municípios que têm condição, e virou quase uma agência reguladora de meio ambiente. Nós precisamos de um estado mais forte. Nós não temos municípios superavitários para dar conta da necessidade. E mais, falar em meio ambiente e integração em época de crise é um caos, porque tudo justifica atropelar o meio ambiente. Nós estamos com coisas mais urgentes, como pagar o funcionarismo. Nós temos coisas mais urgentes de fomentar atividades econômicas. Então, a competição entre os locais, entre os municípios e os estados, faz com que até a sinalização de fiscalização mais branda ambiental seja oferecida. Se não publicamente, seja oferecida de forma subreptícia. Então, eu quero dizer a você, professora, a integração é possível. Passa por esse compromisso ético, passa pela escolha do governante e passa, sobretudo, pela coragem política de fazer uma repactuação do nosso federalismo. Nós estamos com o federalismo, divisão de competências, extremamente desequilibrado. Nós precisamos dialogar sobre isso, senão é feio falar sobre isso. Ao contrário, é extremamente necessário.
Bem, eu queria agradecer a participação, sabe, e também desse assunto complexo, que é a administração do processo de sustentabilidade, como já foi dito e mencionado, envolve, inclusive, às vezes, conflitos de interesses pessoais, individuais, mas ele resulta positivamente com melhoria da educação nessa direção. Isso que é importante, é convencer as pessoas que vale a pena tratar desse assunto. E é claro que isso está ligado à educação global do país, etc. O Brasil não é um modelo sensacional de educação, mas eu acho que a gente chega lá, vai melhorando. Certamente, nos dias de hoje, nós temos uma consciência muito melhor do que há 30 anos atrás. E assim vai ser. Eu queria agradecer a todos e vamos, então, passar para o novo painel, né? Então,
eu agradeço a professora Alisson, o professor Sávio e o professor Lindolfo. Vamos, então, agora eu vou convidar para participar da mesa a professora Marilyn Rubin, que eu já vou falar sobre o seu currículo, o professor Istvan, também um dos organizadores, e vou convidar também o professor Kondo, que é um dos nossos professores com formação em sustentabilidade e que vai, por certo, depois colocar algumas questões participando da mesa. Professor Istvan, professor Kondo. A professora Marilyn Rubin, it's a professor of public administration and economics and director of the MPA program at John Jay College of the City University of New York. She has 35 years of experience work as a consultant and advisor to high-level government officials in the U.S. and abroad on projects related to fiscal policy, gender budgeting, economic development, and strategic planning. She has edited several books and authored many books, chapters, and articles in professional journals, including Public Administration Review and Public Budgeting and Finance. She has been a visiting professor at several universities outside U.S. and has been a Fulbright senior in Ecuador and Brazil. And also, she is a very dear friend of mine, and it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Marilyn, and also she is one of the key persons that made it possible to have this international conference. So, applause before and after her lecture.
Thank you very much, Fatima. I just have to tell you that this is my 6th time in Brazil, and I love it more every time I come. So it's very exciting for me to be here. except in all the time I've been here, I've never been cold. This is the first time I've actually been cold when I've been in Rio. So it was a little bit different for me. I'm a little bit different than the other people who have spoken here today because I'm not an expert on the environment. I am a public finance person, and I teach courses in taxes, taxation, budgets. Students have to take these courses. And I've really, until recently, I've really just touched upon financing sustainability because when I was in school many years ago, and in most of the textbooks written on public finance and on taxes, there's nothing written about sustainability. And so this is sort of something that is going to be coming up in the future. So it was exciting for me to do this because it really made me think a lot more about public finance and taxes and financing sustainability. Why am I going backwards? What am I doing wrong? I was not taught computers. I came into them late in life, as many of us have. I always laugh at my children and my little grandchildren who just laugh at me because they have to come over to help me with everything to do with computers. We've heard a lot so far today about the public sector, the private sector, and we learned a lot about sort of trying to balance sustainability with economic development. And we're finding that governments are facing increasing pressures to reduce environmental damage while minimizing the impact on economic growth. So it's really government has to balance these. And governments have several types of tools to reduce environmental damage. They include information programs, innovation policies, regulations, and taxes. When we think about information programs, we're finding out that most governments throughout the world at all levels are providing information to their citizens and businesses on protecting the environment. And many governments have very elaborate websites on environmental protection. I've just given you a couple here. In California, there's something called the Air Resources Board, and they have this extensive public outreach program to support compliance with air quality regulatory programs. And it's an amazing website. If you're interested in this, I can give you the URL later. In Canada, which is very active in environmental protection, there's something called the Air Quality Health Index, and it informs Canadians about the negative effects of air pollution. And when you go on that site, it's kind of like what we have in the United States and Homeland Security, where there are different colors for different levels of fear having to do with Homeland Security. But there are different colors there used for different levels of air pollution. And you can go on and this has really been developed mainly at the provincial level in Canada, but it's very interesting because you can go out. It's sort of like when you look for the weather report, you can look to see what is going on in the environment to see what the air pollution is like. The second one is innovation policies. And many countries, in fact, most countries, they encourage innovations to protect the environment by offering incentives to businesses for research and development. I knew about the one in South Korea before I started because I had spent some time there. And South Korea provides tax credits for small and medium-sized companies for research and development innovation in 4 areas: electric power, hybrid plug-in or clean diesel vehicles, solar batteries, wind and geothermal energy, and carbon capture and storage. Now, this is interesting because this is part of South Korea's program, not so much to protect the environment, but to encourage the development of small and medium-sized businesses. And so they were doing them together, but the environment kind of came secondary. And the Brazilian one, I have to admit to you that until I began doing research, I wasn't familiar with this one. But the Brazilian Technology Fund, promoted by the Brazilian Development Bank, funds projects to stimulate technological development and innovation in several areas, including bioenergy and environment. And Brazil is seen as one of the countries that really encourages innovation in the environmental area, one of the top countries in the world. And so that was very interesting to me. The third area, in addition to information and innovation, is regulation. And if you were here this morning, you heard Professor Cohen speak about government regulations. And the use of regulations is sometimes referred to, or often, as the command and control approach, because businesses and individuals really have no discretion here, because these are governmental regulations. And government has two ways in which it can regulate in the environmental area. One is that it can establish technology or design standards that mandate specific technologies and production processes that polluters have to use to meet emission standards. So here's where government actually regulates the design standards. The second, which is the one that's used more often, is performance-based standards. And this requires polluters to meet emission standards, but allows them to choose among the methods to meet the standards. And an example that I find very interesting of one of these performance-based standards is something referred to as renewable portfolio standards. Renewable portfolio standards apply specifically to electric producers. And they require that electricity producers supply a minimum share of their electricity from renewable resources like wind, geothermal, and some types of hydroelectricity. And hydroelectricity is interesting because it's a predominant source of power in South America. And so that's a very interesting one, I think. In general, these standards, they set minimum requirements for the share of electricity to be supplied from these renewable energy resources by a specific date. And so in the United States, there are no federal renewable portfolio standards. They're set by the states. And you have to remember that in the United States, the states exist as equal partners with the federal government. And so it's not as if, so once the states have regulations, unless there's a problem with them having to do with judicial issues, the states are the states. And they're given this kind of power under our Constitution. And so as of January 2012, 30 of our 50 states had these RPSs in place. And another 7 states had voluntary goals for renewable energy generation. So we're talking about 37 of the 50 states really trying to regulate emissions from electrical producers. California, which I keep using because it's sort of in the forefront of the states, their standards require that California's electric utilities derive 1/3 of their retail sales from eligible renewable energy resources by 2020. And so they're not there yet, but they have no choice but to be there by 2020. It's interesting how these standards are set. Most of the states with renewable programs, they issue what are called renewable energy certificates. And it's a trading program. And for each unit of power that an eligible producer generates, a certificate or credit is issued. These can be sold either in conjunction with the power or to energy supply companies. And so you have a lot of trading of these certificates. And the market exists because energy companies are required by law in California to redeem certificates equal to their obligation under the Renewable Standards Program. And they provide a way for governments to track the amount of renewable power being sold and to financially reward eligible power producers. It's not only in the United States, but these kind of mechanisms have been adopted in several other countries, including the UK, Australia, Italy, Poland, and Belgium. Now, I originally had China on this list, but when I went back to check about China, I couldn't exactly see what was going on, so I didn't include it on my list of countries. So that's three. Three different ways that government can be involved here. The fourth is what I'm going to spend the rest of my presentation on, and that's taxation. And when we look at taxation, the government's use of taxation can take two different forms. One is to punish. One is to punish, and that's to penalties for those who pollute. The other is for incentives for not polluting the environment. So we have taxes used as penalties and then taxes used as incentives. I'm going to talk about the penalties first. Governments use tax penalties to deal with what we call in economics externalities. Have you taken economics courses where you've studied the term externalities? An externality is a third-party effect. It's the effect on those not actually involved in the transaction. So, for example, if you are on the positive externality side, if you go to get an inoculation against a disease, you're not the only one who is affected. Other people are affected as well, third parties. That is a positive externality. When we're talking about negative externalities, we have something like pollution. And so when we have automobiles that send all of that junk into the air, we are affected by that. If you have a company, for example, that's manufacturing paint, and that company pollutes the water, but we are going to be affected by that pollution, but the company is not including the cost of pollution and it's how it's pricing its product. And so it's the same thing with air pollution. We have companies that are polluting the air, but when they're figuring out how much to charge for their products, they're not including the cost to the society of cleaning up the air pollution. And so that is what is a negative externality. And one of the ways that governments have to address the issue of externalities is to tax. And so we have examples of what we sometimes call green tax penalties, taxes on the level of carbon dioxide emissions, because those who are polluting are not including it in the cost. And so the government is saying, fine, if you're not going to include it in the cost, we're going to tax you, and your tax is going to be another cost. Taxes on pollution from old vehicles, because it's found that they are bigger polluters, because some of the newer vehicles have all these anti-pollution mechanisms in them. And factory pollution. So that company I talked about a few minutes ago that's putting all the garbage into the air and into the rivers in some cases, government says, okay, we are going to have to pay to clean that up. We're going to tax you, and you're going to have to include that tax as one of your costs when you're trying to figure out how much to charge for your can of paint. And so that's, in fact, somebody earlier referred to the oil spill, the BP oil spill in the Gulf. And so they were taxed. When there was a huge oil spill from Exxon in Alaska, in Valdez, Alaska, several years ago, the government charged a tax. Sometimes it's called a fee. Sometimes it's hard to differentiate between a tax and a fee, but I generally refer to them as taxes. The United States doesn't use many green penalties on the federal level. The ones that they have are relatively minor given the level of pollution that exists. One of them is called the gas guzzler tax. If there are vehicles that are sold that where the estimated gas mileage falls below a certain government-imposed level, that vehicle has to pay, or the buyer of that vehicle has to pay a tax. There are certain chemicals that are applied that are applied at a rate proportional to their potential to depleting the ozone level. The taxes imposed on the sale or use of the chemicals by manufacturers or importers. So again, it's another way of government saying to companies, you're not including this, so we're going to charge you a tax that you're going to have to pay, and that's going to add to your overall costs of production. And then there are taxes on fertilizers and pesticides used in agriculture. And that's why I asked the question I did this morning. With the tremendous growth in agriculture in Brazil, I was really curious if they were using any fertilizers and pesticides that were also polluters. I didn't know the answer. I wasn't sure the answer to that question. On state and local level, there are many, many different kinds of taxes and fines that are imposed. I just have two of them here. In municipal solid waste, some local governments, you have to pay per bag for solid waste. And also for beverage containers and automobile batteries. There was a tremendous battle in the city of New York about people having to pay for bottles that they were throwing away. And so now that there's a tax, and people actually collect money when they turn bottles in. So you'll see a lot of, I guess, homeless people wandering the streets of New York collecting bottles, and they go and they collect money on that. California, which again is in the forefront here, and Allison could talk about California as well. They did something very different. Businesses in almost all of the states in the United States pay a tax to the state government. There's what's called a corporate business tax. And businesses that are located in the state are taxed differently than businesses that are located out of state and do business in the state. So if you're a business located in Illinois, for example, you're taxed, and you do business in California, you are taxed differently than a company that's based in California and does business in California. So what they decided to do in California was change the way out-of-state companies are taxed. Remember, companies located out of state, they don't have much political power in the state other than where they're located. And so what they did was they changed the way they taxed out-of-state companies located in California, and they took half of that money, and they were going to use that money to create energy efficient and alternative energy projects. The goal was over 3 years to create 17,000 new jobs. Unfortunately, up till now, only 10% of that number has been created. And so one of the problems is they really haven't figured out a way how to create all of these green jobs quickly. And so that's one, but that's the California way. California always comes up with new ways of using taxes. Globally, European countries have taxes on a broad array of polluters. It's plastic bags, landfill waste, batteries, pesticides, fertilizers, and energy sources such as gasoline and coal. Another option to governments is what are called emission trading systems. And these are called cap and trade systems. And Professor Cohen alluded to these earlier today. They're not technically taxes, but they're seen as an alternative to penalizing companies for polluting with carbon. And a carbon tax imposes a tax on each unit of greenhouse gas emissions. That's the way the tax works. And so the more you pollute, the more taxes you have to pay. The tax looks at the cost or the damage associated with each unit of pollution. That's not easy to measure, but they have found ways to measure units of pollution. A tax and trade system works a little bit differently. It sets a maximum level of pollution, and it distributes emissions permits to companies that produce emissions. And companies have to have a permit to cover each unit of pollution they produce. And they obtain these permits through an individual allocation from the government or through trading with other companies. So if a company is able to reduce its emissions, it can sell its certificates to other companies, and the government then collects money. And so those are the kinds of penalties. What is more used all over the world are tax incentives. Governments don't like to impose penalties because taxpayers scream about penalties. So they try to use, instead of the stick, they try to use the carrot, and they give green tax incentives. They give tax credits, they give tax deductions, in something called accelerated depreciation, which means companies can buy equipment to reduce emissions, and they're allowed to write it off faster on their tax returns. They give deductions for research and development. They give wage incentives for green jobs created. And these incentives apply to different parts of the tax code. So here I really have to put on my public finance professor hat and just tell you what I mean. Businesses have their gross income. In order to go from gross income to what we call taxable income, which is what you pay your taxes on, you're allowed to take certain deductions. So one of these deductions is depreciation. So if you buy a machine, you can deduct, let's say, 1/3 of the cost of that machine over 3 years. When we talk about accelerated depreciation, it means you can deduct the full cost of that machine in 1 year. So what does that do to your taxable income? It reduces it, right? Because it's a bigger deduction. So you can then subtract all of these deductions, and you get to what's called gross tax liability. That's your income that's taxed. You then multiply it by whatever the tax rate is, and you get your what's called tax liability. Once you get your tax liability, you subtract the credits. So a government gives a tax credit for anti-pollution activities of the company of $2,000, and you owe, as a company, $5,000, you subtract that $2,000 right from what you owe. So that's different than a deduction. A deduction you subtract before you get to how much you owe. Is that clear? Yes? No? Yes? Or no? Yes? Say yes. Okay. So governments then give deductions and credits. In the United States, federal environmental tax policy has focused on tax credits and tax deductions for targeted activities. There was something called the Environmental Energy Policy Act of 2005. It was the first major piece of energy legislation since the early 1990s. The incentives were created for energy efficient lighting and heating for electric companies. And so this was the federal government trying to encourage anti-pollution activity by offering tax incentives. Whoops. In other places, the Netherlands provides accelerated depreciation. Singapore provides 100% capital allowance for approved energy serving equipment. So which means if you buy a piece of machinery that you can use to save energy, you can subtract 100% of those costs in 1 year. And that reduces how much taxes you owe. There are many countries throughout the world that offer this. And there is a consulting company called KPMG, and they've developed an index to rank 21 countries according to their use of green tax penalties and assessments. They only looked at national taxes in doing this. They didn't look at any taxes imposed by state and local governments. These are the policy areas they looked at for taxes. They looked at energy efficiency, green innovation, green buildings, water efficiency, carbon and climate change, and a few others. How did they create the index? They looked at how difficult or how easy it was to claim the incentive. They did say that in Brazil, it's one of the more difficult countries to claim these incentives. They said that the Brazil tax system is the most complex tax system in the world. And so it's not always easy. And in the United States, when a survey was done, it was found too that even companies that had professionals prepare their tax returns, they found it difficult to use these tax incentives. And then they looked at whether or not they could carry these tax benefits forward to another year. Because if they didn't need them 1 year, some countries let the companies use them in another year. A high rank in the index means that the country's more active than others in bringing using its tax system to drive sustainable development. So this is 21 countries. I wondered how KPMG picked these 21 countries. For the most part, they're the major economies in the world. But when I called KPMG, they told me that they chose these 21 countries based on whether or not their offices in these countries would give information. So there are countries not included here because the KPMG people didn't supply data. But this is a broad array of countries all over the world. And you can see where Brazil is ranked here. The USA is ranked first on this index. Remember, this doesn't mean that the country's greener. It only means that the country is providing more tax incentives and tax penalties. It doesn't mean that it's greener. And so I'm going to skip that. What's interesting is if you look at the penalties alone, Brazil ranks on the bottom grouping, with the other two Latin American countries included in this index, Argentina and Brazil. Now, I'm not an expert on the Brazil tax code, but it's interesting to me how specific your constitution is about taxation. In the United States Constitution, you never see the word tax. And so in many of the Latin American countries, there's a lot of specificity about what taxes can be imposed at what level. And as far as I can see, in the Brazilian Constitution, there's nothing in there said anything about environmental taxes. You can correct me if I'm not correct, but I couldn't find it. And also in the tax code, but also in some of the research I've been looking at, there are many researchers who feel that the Brazilian Constitution and tax code do not prevent it. They say that it can be used, but it just isn't used right now. When you go to the incentives, at tax incentives to look at the environment, Brazil jumps. Brazil jumps from the bottom to number 12 because Brazil provides many incentives, tax incentives for the environment, especially in the area of innovation. Look where Brazil ranks when it comes to using the tax code to encourage innovation. Of those 21 countries, which include the major economies in the world, Brazil ranks third. And Argentina and the United States are tied for fourth. So in terms of using the tax code to promote innovation, Brazil is ranked higher than the United States and higher than Argentina. I always find it interesting to use Argentina as one of my examples when I speak in Brazil. When it comes to material resources and efficiency in waste management, Brazil also does well. It ranked number 6. And so, again, in terms of using incentives, Brazil does very well. In terms of pollution control and ecosystem protection, Brazil ranks number 8. So again, Brazil is doing very well with its tax code and using it for pollution control and ecosystem protection. When I looked at some subnational governments, there were some interesting things that local governments and provincial governments do. Mexico City has a waste reduction tax incentive. It's a city tax. Quebec has a carbon tax on certain fuels. California, again, my favorite, they have a carbon tax on carbon content in coal, petroleum, and natural gas. And Toronto does something very different and offers cash rebate, where you actually get money back on water-saving equipment. So you can see that local governments are really getting into the act there with their tax system. So to me, my closing question is, well, how successful are environmental taxes? Do they really work? One of the problems with using tax incentives and trying to answer that question is we don't know the real answer. It depends on who's looking at it. Because when it's a tax incentive, you don't know what would have happened without the incentive. So you don't know if companies would have done it anyway. If you ask them, they say, no, we wouldn't have done it. We only did it because of the tax. But when you have a tax that's a penalty, we often hear claims that a carbon tax inhibits economic growth. Businesses don't like taxes. People don't like taxes. And so this is very interesting. There is a success story from British Columbia that I found to be very, very interesting. In 2008, and if you remember, 2008 was right in the middle of the Great Recession. And so most governments were afraid to levy new taxes. But British Columbia passed a tax that covered most types of fuel use and carbon emissions. It started out at $10 a ton of carbon dioxide. Then it was increased by $5 each year. And right now it's Canadian $30 a ton for this carbon pollution. It's what we call revenue neutral, because governments are so afraid of increasing taxes that if they increase one, they try to lower other taxes. So the overall tax bill on the taxpayers is neutral. And so they lowered income taxes and some other taxes. So they now have the lowest personal income tax rate in Canada and one of the lowest corporate tax rate in the OECD. So because of their carbon taxes, they now have very low taxes in other areas. But they have found out that the carbon tax has been incredibly effective in tackling the root cause of carbon pollution, the burning of fossil fuels. We hear that all the time. Since the tax was implemented, the fuel use in British Columbia has dropped by 16%, and that's all the fuels covered by the tax. And in the Kyoto Agreement, the target was 6% in 20 years, and British Columbia has already dropped by 16% since 2008. And the evidence points to the carbon tax as a major driver of the change. Why? What can't we say it was due to? It border buying. In other words, it wasn't because we're going over to the United States or to other provinces to buy. There have been researchers that have estimated that this factor probably accounted maybe for 1 to 2% of the 16% decline. So there was still most of that decline was probably due to the tax. And British Columbia outpaced the rest of Canada on every type of fuel subject to the tax. So, and it wasn't due to a pre-existing trend, because from 2000 to 2008, British Columbia's fuel use was rising by 1.6 1% a year relative to the rest of Canada, where it fell by 4% a year. So it wasn't due to pre-existing conditions. So it wasn't due to any of this. It was due to the fact that there was this tax and people were reacting to this tax by reducing their pollution. So what does this show? It shows, to me at least, that countries can be competitively ambitious in shaping a 21st century economy that internalizes the real costs of production, that you can make polluters pay. In particular, the carbon tax shift encourages employment investment and discourages pollution by taxing emissions. It also promotes energy efficiency and clean innovation. Both of these are critical to success in greening the global market. So what should we do? Building a prosperous, low economic future is one of the great challenges of our time, and you've heard that all day today. And those of you who are here are interested in the environment, and you know this. But with strong evidence from places like British Columbia, I think the time has come for countries to increase their use of the tax code to stop pollution, not only by offering incentives, but by imposing tax penalties. And that's not what a lot of people want to hear, but that's it. And that's my only word in Portuguese. Obrigada.
Well, okay, Professor Marilyn Rubin, it's a real pleasure to hear you. It's extremely relevant to know how you crisscrossed and interrelated so many subjects, such as public policies, fiscal policies, public finance, as well as microeconomics. This creates much more than a blend. This creates a presentation which is pure knowledge. I'd like also to congratulate Professors Alison Miller and Professor Savio Bittencourt because of their speech. And I think that all this stuff is now integrating and creating for us a mold through which one we can really understand a pipeline of integrated activities looking for sustainability. I am opening for some questions. We are very short of time. But I have two ones, and I'd like just to make them very quickly and pass the word to our professor too. So, first of all, I'd like to know from you, given what you said us, which is the learning curve and process in the USA in terms of how did the American companies and people to be adapted to sustainable attitudes, given the fact that several measures are not friendly, such as taxations. And other measures are very necessary, but they would take a lot of time. So the US is known as the biggest consumer of oil, of gasoline in the cars. And this is not necessarily sustainable. It is the biggest world consumer of many goods, plastics, etc. And this is very pollutant. So which is the learning curve? What could you say for us? And the second question is, let us take the case of Brazil. You cited it so well. And Brazil's works done here through the activities of the World Bank. I participated of a work as a consultant of the World Bank where we studied 67 companies here looking for anti-pollution control policies. And the value of the investments in chimneys was exactly of $3.8 billion. When the money and the credits were delivered, 5 years after, practically all these factories at Paraíba do Sul River had changed their machines and equipments, and the World Bank had not thought about that. So what have we really to learn from supranational activities and institutions such as the World Bank, which are financed by the USA mostly?
I think the first question is an interesting question. You remember I said there were four different ways that government can encourage or discourage pollution. The third one was regulation. And I think in the United States, until this point, we've seen tax incentives and regulation because there is such an anti-tax climate in the United States. And so I think you've seen a lot of regulations, and many of the emissions, and in the United States, a lot of the pollution has come from automobiles. And so there has been a whole movement to try to reduce auto emissions, certainly emissions from coal, but there's been, because of the fact that the federal government doesn't have control in many areas over the states, there's been also a controversy over which level of government should be doing this. And so the federal government has basically been saying to the states, if you want to tax, you go right ahead, because we're not going to. So I think that's what you've seen. So you've seen a lot of regulations and tax incentives and not very many federal tax penalties. In terms of the World Bank and other sort of supranational organizations, I think a lot of their work has been in the area of information. I've been following a lot of what the OECD has been doing, and they have a number of books and a number of information pamphlets available to what countries can be doing. And I think what they're trying to do, from what I can see, is they're trying to let countries throughout the world look at the positive examples of what's going on. So they'll look at, for example, what they're doing in the Netherlands, and they'll say, this is what the Netherlands are doing. That's what I've seen as what their role has been so far, more as sort of a conveyor of information. These are sort of the things that are being done now. I mean, that, unless you've seen it differently, that's the way I've seen it.
Thank you very much, Professor Marilyn. I'd like to introduce you also, Professor Edson Kondo, who has a question. And Edson is for us an excellent new acquisition for the undergraduates at the BAPI. Edson now is coordinating at our school the management course. And I think it's a fantastic challenge. So for sure, we do thank you also your participation here.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Esteban. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Rubin, for the very comprehensive and very interesting presentation.
Thank you.
The question I have is related to finance, but perhaps is a little bit different from the approach you chose. Please tell me if the question is too complicated. I apologize in advance.
It is.
But one of the major issues in sustainability is, of course, depending on the organization, but the 2 billion people who earn less than $2 a day, 2 billion people in the world who are marginalized, who are not included in the capitalistic market, people who cannot go into a supermarket or go to a shopping mall because they don't have clothes to wear. And in countries like ours, in Brazil, that's a real issue, which is very present in everyday life. Now, in terms of financing sustainability, is there any country or anybody doing good work in financing those 2 billion people who can be included and also have a more decent life?
So you're referring to something far and away above sustainability. Well, you're talking about real you're talking about not environmental sustainability, but human sustainability, correct?
Well, yes, we can only have a sustainable society if we protect the environment and we protect all human beings.
Well, I think one of the interesting problems is that a lot of people who have been marginalized don't have access to some of the more energy efficient kinds of machines and other things that we're talking about. For example, in the United States, in some of the poorer areas, they tend to burn coal. They tend to burn coal, which has as you know, what the environmental effects are. And so there have been some efforts to get these people to use alternative fuels, but it's been no way yet figured out how to get them the means to use these alternative fuels. So I think that your question really broadens the scope. We're talking about environmental protection, economic development. When we talk about economic development, we generally think of GDP, but I think we're also talking about how do you do this and also bring the poverty rates down. And I wish I could answer that question, but so I think it's three things. Again, in protecting the physical environment, it is, but it's also trying to figure out how to reach all of these people who are outside of the system totally. I don't know of any global efforts. I mean, obviously we have the major organizations like the United Nations and so forth, and we have bilateral donors. But I think that how they choose their projects is the criteria they use maybe have to be looked at more carefully, especially when they're looking at the environment. Then they can really look at, well, who's going to be affected.
Well, thank you very much. My question is because usually when you have environmental disasters or anything, people who are affected most are the poor people and people who are not, are not protected by society. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We have only one unique last question from all of you. Who is the candidate? Okay, that's up to you. And then we will pass once more the word to our general coordinator, Professor Fatima Baima.
Ok. Estamos, então... Tem uma pergunta?
Tem, aqui.
Cadê? Meu querido Jucá, nosso aluno do graduação, faça a sua pergunta.
Vou fazer em português, nesse caso. E, na verdade, a pergunta que eu quero fazer é uma pergunta para todos os palestrantes, para todas as pessoas que estão aqui, na verdade.
Sorry.
Ah?
You want to ask everybody?
Sorry.
Alô?
Ok.
Outra vez.
Outra vez? You are good. You are really good.
Bom, a pergunta que eu tenho para fazer, na verdade, ela está relacionada, não está direcionada, eu estou fazendo a pergunta para todos, no final das contas. Não sei se tem ainda uma resposta clara para o que eu vou perguntar. Como administrador, tudo que foi exposto é brilhante, tudo que foi exposto eu concordo. É necessário ter uma padronização das questões ambientais, um controle legal, como o professor Sávio explicou, uma taxação, a cobrança de impostos ou incentivos que gerem, mas eu vejo muito que essas questões estão ligadas ainda a um comportamento numa lógica de consumo, numa lógica de mercado. E também outra visão minha é que essas questões estão muito mais no âmbito de como se fosse um pai ensinando ao filho, no caso das empresas, dizendo que, olha, você tem que se comportar assim, é importante ter aspectos de sustentabilidade. Mas existe aquele momento em que o filho vai crescer e o filho vai se tornar independente, ele vai se tornar com sua consciência. Eu acho que como o desafio aqui é a questão da sustentabilidade, como chegar nesse momento em que as pessoas elas mesmas percebam que, não, o que importa é ser sustentável, porque na lógica de consumo talvez a gente esteja se encaminhando a uma situação em que, a gente sabe que o ambiente vão acabar os recursos naturais, então temos que procurar novas medidas. Mas, como fazer... Eu acho que justamente isso, como tornar, sair de uma lógica de mercado e entrar mais numa lógica de sustentabilidade mesmo, ou seja, que cada pessoa por si só entenda isso, entenda que é importante ser sustentável. Eu acho que por aí. Pode ser que essa não seja não é uma pergunta fácil.
Muito boa pergunta, Juca. Muito boa pergunta.
It is a very good question.
Essa é uma inquietação que surge pessoal, né? É uma inquietação que surge pessoalmente, porque como administrador, tem tudo isso que a gente vê, tem tudo isso que é importante, a gente tem que se adaptar a essa nova medida. Mas como pessoa
I'll tell
mesmo,
you,
né?
and we have one more speaker that we have to get to, but I'll tell you, when you said about a father teaching, well, I think as a parent, when you teach your children, and if you teach them from the very beginning, you hope they're going to grow up to act in the proper way. And I think that there are more and more people understanding the importance of sustainability. And I think as we integrate this into programs throughout school and universities, that as we do this, it will take time. But I think as we do this, there will be people growing up who understand that importance.
Eu acredito que a sua pergunta tem muito a ver também com aquela que eu fiz sobre a learning curve e o processo. Na verdade, resumindo muito, é bom lembrar que existem estratos estratégicos de atendimento educacional. Para uma nação, para uma comunidade, para o planeta, nós necessitamos dispor de uma macropolítica e temos que ter uma educação generalizada, passando os denominadores comuns de valores mais simples, fáceis de assimilar e tomar. Isso já está sendo feito em nível planetário e cada vez mais é mais fácil com os meios de telecomunicação. Agora, efetivamente, quando você vai chegando naquela camada mais intimista, mais personalista, mais individualista, você necessita ter a capacidade de criar pelo menos 2 elementos que estão associados à capacidade recíproca de aprendizado. Daquele que é o tutor, ensinante, instrutor, professor, pode ser o pai, pode ser a mãe, como a professora Marilyn bem coloca, assim como também pode ser e deve ser aquela pessoa que está captando a mensagem e deve ter a vontade de criar o aprendizado e não meramente apenas pensar sobre o objeto. É muito mais do que cogito ergo sum. É simplesmente perceber que você tem que fazer um esforço no processo de conscientização para entender o conjunto de vantagens que você reterá com as novas atitudes de sustentabilidade que você fará. E isso é uma disciplina, isto é um processo de autoeducação. Assim como existe autoeducação financeira, também existe autoeducação para a sustentabilidade, para o ato de não poluir. Nós estamos indo nessa direção. Mas eu creio que o que o professor Condon muito bem colocou também é fundamental. E o processo necessita ser da inserção de todos os tipos de indivíduos, porque sem que a gente consiga trazer para si aqueles que possuem renda baixa, que infelizmente vivem sob o regime do analfabetismo e da ignorância, nós não podemos ir longe. Se trata de uma massa gigantesca de gente que a gente tem que trazer para si através de uma política pública maior.
Eu posso bem rapidamente? Bom, parabéns aí, Luiz, pela excelente pergunta. Eu queria compartilhar um pouco algo que talvez nem todos concordem. Mas a maravilha que é ficar velho. Porque esse é um momento em que você vai sentindo a fragilidade chegando. E quando a fragilidade chega e você não tem aquela força e a energia de impor as coisas como você tinha quando era jovem, você é forçado a ser sábio. Não que as pessoas fiquem sábias por mágica, mas você é forçado a ser sábio porque tem muito menos recursos. E talvez essa é a nossa esperança. No momento em que a Terra fica mais frágil, talvez os governos, as pessoas, todos nós, como você diz, possamos refletir um pouco e lembrar da nossa fragilidade. Fragilidade coletiva como mundial, como global, e daí sermos mais sábios para que a gente comece a adotar novos processos de decisão, novas formas de consumir, novas formas de decidir, de conviver. E conviver não só conosco, mas com a natureza e com o meio ambiente. Obrigado. Hein?
Muito obrigada. Bom, vamos agora para o nosso último painel do dia. Vou convidar o professor Fronazzi para participar da mesa. O professor Fronazzi tem mais do que 25 anos de experiência em gestão, em consultoria, treinamento, no plano de desenvolvimento internacional. Trabalhou em mais de 20 países, e seu projeto inclui experiências trabalhando com o governo, com o setor público, com o setor privado. O professor From também trabalhou com inúmeras instituições internacionais que doam recursos como Fundação, como USAID, British Council, Swedish no Canadá, alguns governos como o governo do Canadá, da Alemanha, Rockefeller Brothers Funds, Open Society Institute e Ford Foundation. Eu fico muito feliz em tê-lo aqui conosco, e vai fechar o nosso seminário com chave de ouro, porque a Fundação Getulio Vargas, sendo um think tank, além de pensar, de ensinar, tem um papel de aplicar, de implementar soluções através dos seus projetos que são desenvolvidos, da sua consultoria, e estamos numa academia, mas numa academia que preza a aplicabilidade, e nesse sentido é muito importante para nós termos a presença do professor From com este enfoque da teoria prática.
Thank you very much to Fatmia and the Vargas Foundation inviting me. Just a few confessions before I start. One is, I'm not a professor. I played a professor in a play long time ago. That's the closest I've ever come to. The second is that it's quite embarrassing that someone from Arizona State is here talking about sustainability issues, considering we're the most unsustainable state, and I live this most unsustainable lifestyle. So when I was invited here, I said, obviously, I can't speak about sustainability. But what I propose to do is to speak about, if it's possible, how can we actually engage, or to discuss why universities should be engaged more directly in developing and implementing sustainability solutions. And the challenge for me, as one of the faculty members there just said a little while ago, is not only about how you work in your own backyard, but how do you expand your services to the international community, in particular the poor countries? As a statement then in June of 2013 by the World Bank, global warming will affect the poor countries the most. So the purpose of this presentation I have here is less about research and more about applied. And in doing so, I will discuss two very simple issues. One is the problem. The problem here is really lessons learned, and can we avoid making the same mistakes we made with most aid-led programs when it comes to work in developing countries. And the part two is the changes that universities need to make to solve sustainability challenges, or for that matter, to be involved much more in applied projects. This means the kind of demand they have on their faculty, their award system. Last but not least, and the most important thing to me, because that's how I make my living, is the changes we need to make to the large Western international donors that they need to make to even a playing field so universities can compete for these applied projects. And I'll explain that in greater detail. So before I go any further, let me just tell you about my perspective. First of all, I'm a non-academic. The second part, I spent my last 25 years of developing and implementing democratic development countries worldwide, from Eastern Europe to Southeast Asia. My projects were funded by the US government, the European government, and major foundations, and they're related to good governance, independent media, conflict resolution, anti-corruption, and so forth and so on. Today, sustainability and international development is what civil society and good governance was 25 years ago. So some of the lessons that we learned during the democratic development phase that may apply to sustainability, or for that matter, they should avoid. The first mistake that I made, let me speak about myself, is that we took a cookie cutter approach to the way we presented the problems and the solutions. What does that mean? That means we took the same democratic development program that we implemented, let's say in Bulgaria, and presented it also to Guatemala. Solution has to be tailored to the needs and the capacity of the community. We cannot take the same approach as we did with democratic development. The second thing is that too often we ask the locals to find a solution to find a problem to fit to our solution. How did this come about? Well, we sat in New York and Washington, D.C., international consulting firms, and we developed the actual solution. And with little input from the locals, when it comes to sustainability, this must stop. What's another factor? Most of the projects I ran were between $10 to $25 million. Out of these projects, I think maybe I awarded $50,000 at most for issues relating to environment, not sustainability, environment, meaning most of the international projects today do not include sustainability as part of the component. At best, actually, it was a small little grant for an organization to deal with pollution or waste. Another big problem we had, with all respect to all the professors here, was we parachuted a lot of you in and out. It became global tourism. You came in for a week or so, gave your lecture and left. This must come to an end, and you'll see why a little later of the argument I make here. Last but not least, we were measured by the project, the success of the project, not the success of the country. This must definitely come to an end when it comes to sustainability. So here's my argument. We can't afford to make these same mistakes when it comes to funding and implementing sustainability projects in developing countries. Simply speaking, sustainability is just too big to fail. We cannot treat sustainability as a project. That means donors and international development organizations often move on once the project is completed. But when it comes to sustainability issues, this again must come to an end. We need more creative ways how to come in early and stay late when it comes to solving some of these major complex global problems. We also need to address the immediate resource needs while safeguarding the next generation. A point to actually your question that you asked, but how do we educate the next generation while we're addressing the current one? And here's the one that why I came to this conference in the first place, is to convince the universities that we need to actually use scientists and researchers to take lead in developing and implementing solutions while increasing the knowledge and capacity, or we'll continue to make the same exact mistakes we made during the democratic development era where I worked. So why this urgent call for universities to push their faculty beyond assessing problems towards implementing solutions? Well, simply speaking, it was you, scientists and scholars, that told us that, well, the Earth will expire by 2050. So for me, as someone a non-academic, I took this extremely serious. I said, time is of the essence. Let's get going, right? But to the credit of the universities, in fact, you have done actually a lot. Or I would say, in the sense of bringing, the universities have played a central role in bringing attention to the nature and magnitude of GHG's emissions and global warming. At the same time, universities have been quite successful in coming up with applied projects to help communities affected by climate change. Some of these you'll recognize. The solar drip irrigation system. In fact, I think the captain or the colonel spoke a little bit about that. The biodiversity conservation, land and livestock management, sustainable tourism, clean water, waste management, health, PV solar energy. These are fantastic programs. Unfortunately, a lot more needs to be done. Why? Just take a look at any given day in any one of the headlines, newspapers around the world. What does it say? It says that more is needed to be done. Scientists are warning us continuously about global warming. The mass migration is no crisis. The Guardian quotes there. So on any given day, in any given newspaper around the world, the headlines are calling for all hands on deck when it comes to challenge to climate change. 2 weeks ago, some people responded to this. The Muslim leaders and experts from 20 countries emerged from talks in Istanbul with an 8-page declaration urging Islam's 1.6 billion followers to recognize and take action against the threat of climate change. So here it is. So why are university faculty hesitant to engage in applied projects? As I said earlier, for the most part, universities place rigorous demands on faculty for teaching, research, and publications, which prevent them from participating in applied projects. Another reason why? There's little if any incentive to do field work. Due to the teaching and research load, most faculty simply don't have the time to do it. In my own university, at Arizona State University, when I approach faculty, they ask me such questions as, can I use the applied projects for my research data? I'm only available at a certain time of the year. And because, again, as I said earlier, because of their load for teaching, the heavy load for teaching and research, they need at least a 1 year advance to consider an applied project. The other aspect of why a lot of faculty refuse to get involved, simply speaking, the applied project process or donor application is really very complex, and it just scares a lot of the faculty away. I'll speak a little bit more on that a little later about what we're trying to do at ASU with that. But that said, the question is, how can universities get more involved in applied projects? Or for that matter, try to actually get the faculty to be more involved. First of all, they can begin by providing faculty with financial and academic incentives to create relationships on the ground. It's a precursor to proposed research and development work, so they can ultimately engage directly with the local organizations. It's what I said in the beginning. Don't make the mistake we made when we were implementing democratic development projects last 20 years, by creating and finding the solution in your classroom and then asking the locals to actually find a problem to fit to it. The other thing we can do is university should acknowledge the fieldwork as an essential part of the reward system. For example, allow the applied project to be used as a criteria for tenure. Another thing they can do is they can push research that goes beyond identifying the problem to offering practical solutions. Last but not least, extend the peer review to practitioners, to civil society representatives, businesses. And some of these examples. In my own university, I work for the Walton Sustainability Solutions Initiatives. What we do there, I put a team together, and our job is very simple, is to bridge the gap between the faculty, the local organizations on the ground, and the donor. And we actually just guide the process. Most of it is, in fact, guiding the actual application, the process for the funder, for the donor. Another example is the Scientists Without Borders. It's a web-based community dedicated to sharing and advancing innovative science and technology-based solutions to the world's most pressing global development challenges. It's free. Anyone go in there, you can ask any question, and some scientists around the world will try to answer it. There's also, obviously, Columbia University's Earth Institute is another great example. These and other such initiatives, for the most part, rely on the generosity of donors. I hate to break the news to everybody here. This is a donor-driven world. So, with that in mind, I quote some frustrated people in my field who do business development and fundraising. The one that seems to capture the best is, an idea without funding is nothing but an illusion. By some army captain in Kosovo said this in 2000. The one that actually kind of makes me chuckle is the one below this, says Martin Luther King didn't get up 50 years ago and say, I have a budget and a plan. Unfortunately, if you want funding, you need to have a very good budget and a very good plan. And who's hit the hardest because of the donors? Well, again, it comes back to the poor countries are being hit the hardest when it comes to funding for sustainable programs. At the moment, the progress for sustainability for developing countries is way below the estimated needs. The 100 billion that was promised in 2009 in Copenhagen for the poor countries, only half of that has been committed so far. The Pope pointed the finger of blame at rich countries, calling on them to pay the grave social debt they owe to the poor. If the Pope cannot forgive the rich countries, then I would say this is extremely serious. So for the sake of, because I'm in an academic conference, here's my only chart, just because I'm at an academic conference. I was told you need an academic, a chart or something. This is a very simple one. It just shows the official development assistance, climate-related funding for poor countries. As you can see, gradually it's been increasing, but it's far from enough of what's needed. So let me start now about, funding at the moment, and I think there was a question about this earlier, is where is it at the moment? Funding for the most part continues by the international donors, remains in the most part in the traditional good governance and market reform sectors. So as a practical person, I have one simple question. Why should donors invest billions of dollars into market reform, healthcare, education, democracy around the world when scientists, you, are telling us they will not stand a test of time? I'm not asking the aid agencies and donors to stop their current programs or change them drastically. All I'm asking is allow sustainability to become part of their programs. I want to join them. I don't want to change them. Let me give you some examples of what we can do. What can donors do? They can include sustainability as a cross-cutting issue across all of their international development programs. In the Rule of Law Project, for example. Include training for judges on environmental issues. At the same time, they could also give the courts better tools to review and decide on cases that may harm the health and well-being of society. Another example, in disaster relief projects, focus infrastructure development on environmental friendly green design and construction projects. For democracy and media programs, include components that hold both corporations and governments accountable on such issues as carbon emission standards and waste management. Another thing they should do when it comes just to funding, they should place less emphasis on corporate structures and immediate results, and more attention how the project will impact the behavior of the next generation and beyond. What do I mean by this? Many international donors require institutions demonstrate a track record working in a country or previous experience working with that donor. This makes it extremely difficult for many universities to compete against the international consulting companies that have more institutional experience working on or managing large aid funds, but not necessarily the expertise that's found in many universities to address a lot of the climate change issues that we're facing at the moment. Another thing that aid agencies can do, they should require that solution-driven projects include environmental sustainability education programs for all students of ages. This will help expedite the productive behavior changes and give citizens a stake in their country's long-term sustainable growth. Another thing that donors can do, they can demand more creative ideas for long-term commitments from international implementing partners by structuring awards to require not only thoughtful project design, but also a strategy for staying involved in a country long after project funding ends. What does this mean, actually? The way it works currently is that most of the international consulting companies, including the one I used to work for, were driven by profits. Meaning the minute we win a given project, before it's implemented, we're peddling that idea to other countries around the world. This must come to an end when it comes to sustainability. And here's my argument. I believe that universities are a perfect partner for the donors if we want to address sustainability issues. We're an ideal venue for it because we can drive the impact. We can tackle the immediate issues while educating the next generation. We can provide both the short-term and long-term solutions. We can lead ongoing efforts to share knowledge, increase capacity, and provide education and training opportunities. We can connect with established local partners, including institutions, universities, rather than parting blindly in response to a new project or funding opportunity. Now, in order for this to be done, I think the way forward may require challenging the archaic purpose of the university as a community of teachers and scholars to include greater emphasis on applied solutions. One thing is certain, universities and international donors will need to make a change if we are to take Carl Sagan's warning only a few decades ago seriously. As he said, anything else you're interested in is not going to happen if you can't breathe the air and drink the water. Don't sit this one out. Do something. Thank you.
Alguma pergunta? Pergunta da audiência. Bom, do you have the microphone? Okay. Do you have like the rates of success of the implementation of those programs that got funds from of those donors? Which are the effectiveness of those programs, and how do the donors control this money, those funds?
So did everybody get a question?
Yes. He also has a question.
I gave you a list of, let me just go back here if I can to answer that question. Can I go back here? No, you took it off. The list I gave you, the projects, the drip irrigation, waste management, those are a summary of the major projects currently being implemented by universities worldwide. Just one second, I'm sorry. Okay, this is done. All right, let's go this way. Okay. So if you take a look at this list, these two, what I did was I went and looked at most of the universities in the United States and said, what kind of projects are they implementing? And this is a summary of it. And it's quite often, it's actually driven by the donor. The food security program out of USAID, the water problem, so forth. They've actually identified the problem. A lot of these universities actually have been quite effective in helping these places, meaning not so much the country, but it's still the project. The other challenges we face, as I mentioned in this presentation, is how successful are they? If you read my reports that I wrote for USAID, I personally saved 25 countries because that's the way we actually are meant to write the reports. I can tell you from these projects, they have an immediate impact in that community, but not the kind that I think maybe the question is asking, how many countries have actually been taken from facing these climate change problems to actually solving them. We're still in the middle of that progress.
We have one more question from Professor Savio is not going the boat, so he's going to make the question. But Professor Istvan also had one. He's not going to make the question. He's going to do the question on the boat in Belém, Pará, because you want to follow the schedule. Okay, go ahead, Professor.
What about the tools for the legal system, for the judge to...
You're right. No, I have to be careful because I have to make a living from these donors. I can't criticize them too much, okay? So are there any donors in the audience? Usually I ask that question before I give any lecture anywhere. And when they say no, I go, good. Most of the stuff that you see here, including the rule of law, it's a reactive. Very rarely we've taken in international development a proactive approach. In the rule of law, we're still having a hard time of introducing these sustainability components. The reason for it has to do a little bit with the United States government foreign policy. We have to be very careful about the choice of climate change in our own country, United States, especially when it comes to, in fact, implementing USAID projects. So what we've done with a lot of the rule of law projects is we've supported think tanks on the ground, such as yours, the Vargas Foundation, and asked them to work with the assembly, or for that matter, with the government, to come up with laws that actually try to hold some of them these standards. We've also brought in experts from the United States, but we unfortunately, for a period of time during, this is going to be getting me in trouble, during the Bush era, we had to be very, very careful about some of these issues. So again, unfortunately, as much as I like to say that, and I'm speaking about mostly government aid agencies, there was a lot of politics that was also involved. The private foundations, many of them in the United States, have actually incorporated sustainability in their programs. The reason why they don't want to work with the universities, with all respect to everybody who is from the university, is because you guys like to do too much research. People want to see the impact. The great thing about it, and I stop here just to give an idea, even USAID has actually made a very interesting change in the way they're working now around the world. They're actually looking for innovations to challenge today's sustainability, and they've put actually conditions on that grant, saying, I want you to show me not only the innovation of how to address water or whatever the issue may be, but show me how you're going to work with the government and the business. And the biggest mistake we made in 25 years of democratic development is we left the business sector out of the picture. So now it's finally, there were some lessons that were learned. So that were ways to go. But when it comes to the rule of law, I would say for the most part, there haven't been too many programs that I know of that said, I want you to go out there and provide this kind of training to judges or to the members of parliament. There've always been subcomponents of much larger projects.
Ok, thank you very much. Muitos acham, quando vêm visitar o Brasil, ao verificar uma série de obras que estão sendo realizadas, que nós não vamos conseguir terminá-las para a Olimpíada de 2016. Eu digo assim, não, os brasileiros conseguem. E fazendo uma analogia com este seminário, quando viram aqui 10 pessoas pela manhã na mesa de abertura, a mesa nem cabia, mais um professor fazendo Skype lá da Columbia University, e nós estamos terminando no momento certo. Então, nós somos capazes de fazer e fazemos. Né? Não tem crise, não tem nada, nós fazemos acontecer. Então, já concluindo, agradeço muitíssimo a audiência, todos estão convidados agora a pegar a van, aqueles que nos seguem, para ir a Belém, ver no local a questão da sustentabilidade na Amazônia, o barco e os nossos queridos professores, também coordenadores, para a palavra final. Muito obrigado a todos.
Well, I think this event was a turning point in Getulio Vargas Foundation, because always we're talking about mathematics, applied mathematics in economics and business, and this is quite different. And this had a big impact because the president and the others, the top executives of Getulio Vargas Foundation were around here. And so I feel very happy. That's a turning point. And we are going to teach sustainability, not only sustainability, but have it across all the courses, Finance and sustainability, accounting and sustainability, economics and sustainability, so on and so forth. We had the luck to have the Minister of Environment with us today. And it was quite special to move from Brasilia and be back in the same day. To have the president of Embrapa. Embrapa is maybe the biggest producer of technical and scientific work in agribusiness in Brazil, and one of the biggest in the planet. And he was here, and he was very happy, and was have lunch with us. And to finish, I think Dr. Fronazzi had a special consideration that my big friend, Istvan Katzner, reminded me. Sustainability is too big to fail. And I don't think the sustainability is going to fail in Brazil and elsewhere, because this is the legacy for our children, for our grandchildren. So this is the beginning of a hard work to have a better planet, not only in Brazil, but all over the world. Thank you very much, and I pass the palette. I pass to Professor Katzner.
Well, I think that first of all, we should thank a lot Professor Fátima Baima as well as Professor Antonio Freitas, who did a great job. They really did it. This is the consequence of lots of meetings and some struggles, of course. And for sure, it's very important as a meeting because we are creating something new at Fundação Getulio Vargas, also through all of you. We are going now to Belém to Pará, and we will have discussions on a boat, and we will pass through conferences, debating everything when we are navigating. Well, I can guarantee you that I am not a sailor, and I hope I won't go towards the lower waters. For us, it's extremely good to have a new sensation, a sensation related to the Amazon as a place where we can and we must also discuss our Brazil. So you have helped us to get more conscious and also to pass this knowledge to people who might not be here now and today, but who tomorrow and in the next 2, 3, 4 days will think about Brazil's sustainability at our northern region and at our biggest geographic region. So this is extremely relevant because we are just making what? Unionizing our country and thinking that we all together must work for the same country. Thank you very much.
Also, I want to remember two things. First of all, we are going to have a film that Professor Antonio Carlos is providing, that we are going to make it available on YouTube. And our friend Norman has a master program, a full master program on sustainability. So maybe it's the first master program in Brazil on sustainability. So we are very proud of that. We are fighting on this, and maybe Professor Norman was maybe the leader of it. And we are going to win this war. Thank you very much.
My family for the conference. I was an opportunity, you know. Yeah. But I want to look at the part because I've been the executive director of a nonprofit for many years, 14 years up until 2 months ago. Yeah. But now I'm here to move on to a new direction, to my own consulting. I have had a consulting business in the past, you know. I'm relaunching it, but I want to move on to more sustainable cities consulting. Yeah, sustainable communities. Exactly. I only have my new card in here. The new position here. This is my old run from my nonprofit. We did a lot. It's called ECO, Environmental Foundation of Miami. Yeah, in fact, I did a lot. I'm not bragging, I did a time on age, my to 99. There's nothing being talked about sustainability, and in fact, I established a sustainability committee for the state of Miami Beach, sustainable hospitality calls for the Hotel Association. So we developed running a lot of bicycle sharing program, car sharing program, electric charging stations. Over 20 products have been implemented. Yeah, anyway, so I was very fascinated by your presentation by the Earth Institute. I would think initially it was the Earth Island Institute, which is different, right? I'm gonna check you guys out. So I really enjoyed that. Thank you so much. Same here. Okay.